Good evening, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival. Thank you so much for joining us for another virtual Wisconsin Book Festival event. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Jess Nordell and Kim Todd to discuss Jess's new book, The End of Bias. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us. We're really excited.
Absolutely. It is always wonderful to host someone who has a Wisconsin connection. And Jess, you went to school here at the University of Wisconsin, is that right?
Yes, I did my MFA at the University of Wisconsin, and I also grew up in Green Bay.
Oh my gosh. See, I don't get all the information. That's fantastic. Well, welcome to the Wisconsin Book Festival. Um, Jess and Kim are joining us from Minnesota, and I really appreciate it. We do have people from all over the country and all over the world with us tonight. And I will cede the conversation to Kim and Jess in just a moment. But first, as always, I want to thank Madison Public Library, the Madison Public Library Foundation, and all of our sponsors for their unwavering support of free cultural events for Madison, for Wisconsin, and now for anyone who wants to tune in to our Crowdcast channel. We do have another virtual event coming up on Thursday night with Jessie Daniels for her book Nice White Ladies. And then we'll have one more virtual event the first week of December, which is the UW Press and Wisconsin Creative Writing Department Poetry Prize winner reading. So please sign up for our Crowdcast, follow us, and you'll get notified anytime we have a virtual event. I just want to say off the top that Jessica Nordell is a science and culture writer. She has been published in The Atlantic, in the New York Times, in the New Republic, and many, many, many other places. She also wrote for public radio, and now she's given us this book about unconscious bias and how we can eradicate unintentional bias and discrimination in our own lives. Jess is joined tonight by Kim Todd, who is an award-winning author of literary nonfiction. Please check out Kim's book, Sensational. It's a hidden history of America's girl stunt reporters. It is more than Nellie Bly, but Nellie Bly's in there, right? That's right, Kim?
Yep.
Yep.
Started off.
And you can find Kim's work in the Best American Science and Nature Writing Anthology. You can hear Kim's work on Science Friday. And they are both, as I mentioned, joining us from Minnesota. I'm going to step away, and I'll see you in an hour. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks to everyone for coming out tonight. And please think of questions as we're chatting and put them in the Q&A at the end. I wanted to start out by saying that Jess and I were in a writing group together here when she was working on this book. And we're here tonight in Jess's house together.
We're doing something unusual. We're doing a virtual event, but we're both in the same place. So we're literally sitting across from each other right now. That's my kitchen, and this is the dining room.
Yeah, so we were here in this space, and I got to watch her work on The End of Bias and see it go from early drafts to the beautiful final version. And I'm so thrilled that this important book is out in the world. And Jess, I wanted to know if you would start by reading us a section to give us an understanding of the project.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I just wanted to say also, thank you so much. While we were getting ready to get started, Connor shared some of the readout of where people are tuning in from. And we actually have people from all over the world, which is so exciting. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to start with, I'm actually just going to start from the introduction of the book, which sort of sets the stage for some of the kinds of issues that I discussed throughout through one specific case study. So I'll start with this. Years after his cancer treatment, Ben Barris recalled how he had phrased the request to his oncologist. "While you're removing my breast," he'd asked, "could you please take off the other one?" Cancer ran in the family, so the doctor agreed. But the truth is, Barris just wanted the breasts gone. Christened with a girl's name and raised as a girl, he had never been at ease with that identity. Not as a 4-year-old, feeling he was a boy. Not as a teenager, uncomfortable with the changes of puberty. Not as an adult, squeezed into heels and a bridesmaid dress. This was 1995. It was before Laverne Cox and Caitlyn Jenner were household names, before a Google search for transgender provided legal advice, before Google. Barris didn't understand what being trans was, but the double mastectomy was an enormous relief. A year later, he read an article about a trans man and the lights came on. Barris was eager to begin hormone treatment, but he had a major concern, his career. At 43, he was working as a neurobiologist at Stanford and had recently made a groundbreaking discovery about the significance of the glia, brain cells whose roles had been previously underestimated. Others in the scientific community had always perceived him as a woman. He had no idea how they would respond to this change. Would students stop wanting to join the Barris lab? Would invitations to conferences disappear? The scientific community did react, but not in the ways Barris had feared. After his transition, people who did not know he was transgender started listening to Ben more carefully. They stopped questioning Ben's authority. Ben, middle-aged, white, and male, was no longer interrupted in meetings. He was, again and again, given the benefit of the doubt. He even received better service while shopping. At one conference, a scientist who didn't know Ben was transgender was overheard saying, "Ben gave a great seminar today, but then his work is so much better than his sister's." Barris was astonished. Before his transition, he had rarely detected sexism. Even overt examples hadn't registered. Once, when Barris was an undergraduate at MIT and the only person in a math class to solve a hard problem, the professor said, "Your boyfriend must have solved it for you." Barris was offended. He had solved it himself, of course. He didn't even have a boyfriend. But he didn't think of the comment as discriminatory because he thought sexism had ended. And even if it hadn't, he didn't identify enough as a woman to think sexism could apply to him. He was just furious to have been accused of cheating. Pre-transition, Barris assumed he had been treated like everyone else. Now he had stunning evidence to the contrary. It was almost a scientific experiment. He had the same education, same skills, same achievements, same capacity. All the variables had been held constant, except one. Barris saw, with searing clarity, that his daily encounters, his scientific career, his life, had all been shaped by the gender others saw, in ways that had been invisible even to him. Before transitioning, his ideas, contributions, and authority had all been devalued, not overtly generally, but in a way that was noticeable when that devaluing suddenly vanished. Now the differences in the ways men and women were treated were discernible, the way new patterns appear on flower petals under ultraviolet light.
Thank you, Jess. So you mentioned that this was like a scientific experiment in a way, like unwittingly conducted by this individual. But you ended up doing a deep dive into all of these scientific experiments that combat the ways that we can overcome bias, both individually and within organizations. And so how did you get interested in this topic and started on the project?
Yeah, I had been, it's always hard to go back. How did I first get interested? I feel like this topic has been like living in my heart and soul for decades. But I think that, I originally got really focused on gender bias because of an experience I had that was not that dissimilar from Ben Barris's, actually. I was a young journalist starting out in my career and trying to break into national magazines and newspapers. And I found that I wasn't getting a lot of traction. People weren't responding to me. So I, one day, kind of in a moment of desperation, decided to send out a query with the name JD instead of Jessica, using a gender neutral or maybe even masculine sounding name to present my ideas. And that pitch got accepted within hours. And it was the same pitch as the ones that had been, I had just heard nothing back from. And it was a shocking moment in my life because I think, like Barris, I knew that, gender bias was sort of in the ether. I hadn't had really overt experiences. Or let me say that differently. when I had experiences of sexism, either they were overt enough to be able to identify clearly, or I just didn't know that they were, that's what's happening. So this was kind of an experiment of mine that I conducted. And that really like cracked things open for me. I think it made me aware of how much these kinds of biases might be affecting my life, other women's life, other marginalized groups' lives constantly. And from there, I got interested in bias as a general phenomenon, which I think of as, the assumptions and stereotypes that we apply to others in a way that can devalue them. And from there, got interested in what we do about it. So it kind of was an organic process that started with my own experience and then opened up into the larger world.
Right. I'm curious, did you let the editors know after the piece was accepted that you were Jessica, or was it just an email correspondence that you just kept up JD the whole time?
I kept up JD. I was terrified. I thought if I let them know that I'm not JD, that I'm Jessica, maybe, they'll change their mind. I was like a young journalist and I didn't really know what to do. And not only that, I actually continued to pitch stories as JD for years afterwards. And it became very awkward because, an editor would call me on the phone and I'd say, "Hi, this is Jessica. I mean, JD." Like I was really bad at maintaining maintaining kind of this other name when it wasn't actually the name that I use every day. So ultimately, I just sort of threw up my hands and said, I'm just gonna present myself as Jessica and let the chips fall where they may. But it's an experience that has stayed with me, for about 2 decades now.
I know that you spent, 5 years on the book ultimately, once you had decided to write it. How did your ideas change from the start to the end of the writing process? And was there one thing that you discovered, one interview, one study that really maybe pushed you in a different direction?
There were a few ways that the process of writing the book changed me and changed my ideas. I think one of the things that changed over the course of writing the book was that I went into it with the mindset of a science journalist. And I thought, I am going to read every study that has been published on this topic. And I'm going to do basically a self PhD on, the topic of bias and discrimination. And I'm going to report and I'm going to synthesize and I'm going to share this, collected sort of synthesized integrated wisdom with my readers and learn. And it's going to be this great, scientific discovery process. The process ended up becoming much more personal and much more, I would say almost spiritual, because I couldn't help but be changed by what I was learning and what I was reading. And, I think I went into the process thinking like most people do, like I'm probably a little less biased than everybody else. And I was quickly disabused of that because I found myself having to confront my own biases and the way that these phenomena that I was reading about, in journal after journal were also very much alive for me in my own mind, my own heart, my own interactions. So that was a painful process. I had to confront things like internalized misogyny, ways that toxic cultural lies about women's value had also worked their way into my own way of seeing myself and other women. I had to confront ways that toxic lies about racial hierarchy had also worked their way into me as a person who lives in this culture, a racist culture. And and so that it ended up becoming, much more of a sort of recursive process of reading, studying, reflecting, changing, then going back to the research, changed, and kind of iterating on that. So that was one big kind of change. I think another way that my ideas changed over the course of writing the book was that I think in our culture, we like to sort of make things very simplified and binary. And certainly we see that with gender, but I think that also happens with psychology. And we, the way that unconscious bias is thought of or presented in research is sometimes as a binary, like a bias is either conscious or unconscious, or it's implicit or explicit. And they're different things. And what I came to really understand was that it's not so simple as unconscious and conscious or implicit and explicit. And in fact, there are so many different forces and factors at play anytime we're having an interaction with another person. Some of the forces might be unconscious, some of them might be conscious. It's a combination. So there's much more of a continuum. And I think I came to really feel that what was important was not the cognitive origin of these things, but the way that they affected our actual behavior. So what I became much more interested in over the course of writing the book was actual behavior in the real world and how people are affected by one another rather than what's necessarily happening implicitly or explicitly in the mind.
Yeah, fascinating. So it does seem like that you read every possible article on this topic in the whole world and did a self PhD. So congratulations for that. But you also did like a lot of on the ground reporting, interviewing people, going places, putting yourself in different situations. And you did that particularly with regard to policing. And a lot of the book talks about potential ways to reduce bias in policing. And that's certainly something, we've been thinking about a lot here in Minneapolis. Can you talk about some of the research that you did on strategies to improve policing and the things that you found?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, over the course of writing this book, well, let me back up. I think, when we think about bias, the encounters between police and citizens are encounters where bias has its most severe consequences or can have the most severe consequences. And so I was really, it was very urgent. It felt very urgent for me to look and see whether there were approaches to reducing bias and discrimination that worked in the policing context. Because if it can work in the policing context, maybe it can also work in other contexts as well that are really consequential. So yeah, I mean, there was a lot. Fortunately, there are some things that I found that do have data behind them, approaches that work. One of the approaches that I looked at is something that is being practiced out in Oregon right now. I ended up spending a lot of time with police in Bend, Oregon, and other parts of Oregon. And what is happening in a sort of small cohorts over there is there are efforts to try to basically remake officers kind of from the inside out, recognizing that the job of policing over time starts to create very cynical, hardened, traumatized people. And as one sergeant put it to me, and I mean, it's a cliche, but he said, Jessica, hurt people. And another lieutenant said, to be honest, we're broken. We are broken people. And I really saw that and felt that when I was talking to officers, when I was spending time with them. I think that there are really severe mental health and well-being consequences to being a police officer in the United States that have severe and unimaginable consequences for the communities that they are interacting with. So the approach of this particular group of people is to try to introduce mindfulness practices and other well-being practices for officers with the thinking, with the idea that improving the well-being of officers will trickle down into the community and affect the community more positively as well. It'll improve their performance. And there's some positive signs that this can work. There are small scale studies, but studies that show that officers have reduced aggression, better emotional regulation, fewer angry outbursts, things like this. So, you know, there's so many problems with American policing, obviously, and it, you know, improving it is going to take so many different policy changes and structural changes. But that's one approach that seems to have some good data behind it, that it can have a positive impact. There's another approach.
No, but I just wanted to follow up on that,
please.
Because one of the most interesting parts of your book to me is this trip that you take and you attend one of the trainings in Oregon, and you chart a ton of resistance to it, right? Mm-hmm. It's not an easy introduction of this idea and these practices. And I just, wondered if you talk about that a little bit and what your takeaway might have been.
Yeah, I was even thinking, what if I read like a paragraph from the aftermath? Because what Kim is describing is I went to a retreat, a retreat for officers that was meant to introduce them to these mindfulness practices, and it was actually kind of a disaster. The officers rebelled, they mutinied. I'll just read to you a couple of paragraphs from that experience. This was after the trainer was introducing how to do mindfulness meditation, why it was beneficial, what effects it could have over the course of a weekend. Later that night, some of the cops mutinied, lashing out at Gerling. Gerling was the officer who was leading the training. "You're talking down to us," a sergeant said. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. You're saying cops are unhappy, we're unhealthy. You're saying there's something wrong with us." Gerling listened. Here was everything we'd been speaking about: the anger, the anxiety, the defensiveness, the threat. I could see Gerling trying to slow this encounter down and breathe, just as he'd been trying to coach the officers to do. "I didn't mean to suggest there's anything wrong with you," Gerling said slowly. "But that's what you're saying," the sergeant insisted. He was getting angry and his voice turned hard. He stared at Gerling. "I'm as happy as I can be," he yelled. Then a lieutenant said loudly, "I think if you need this, you're weak. Go be a teacher." The air felt combustible. And then I go on to describe the aftermath, but I just wanted to share a couple of more sentences about when I talked to Gerling afterwards about this kind of disastrous effort to change police. A few days later, I met up with Gerling in Hillsboro, Oregon. We drove the quiet streets in his black SUV. He's used to resistance, he told me, but he did not expect the level he encountered at the retreat. He traced it to the fact that many officers had been forced to be there, but also to a culture that's so hardened, so traumatized, that it can't even allow itself to be helped. That was toxic police culture on display, he said flatly. Ego, fear, and anger are what officers bring to every encounter, he said. And there it was, all of it. There was also a fear of looking weak, of seeming insufficiently masculine. And it doesn't have to be that way. He drove us past a teenager in camo shorts carrying a plastic bag and scowling. "Take this kid across the street," he said. "I can say, oh, he probably stole those shoes, because how could he afford those bright shoes? I could just be a biased person. Or I can be like, yeah, he's got some stuff from Target he bought. He's this young man trying to find his place in the world, and how he walks and how he dresses is about power, and he's reaching for some. And I can understand that and not be offended by it. How he walks up to me is not an affront to my authority."
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, the level of resistance. And then I guess, how do you work with that? Or, how is change possible in that kind of situation?
One of the things that I really came to believe over the course of researching and writing this book was that there are a lot of interventions that do have positive effects. We have lots of studies that show there are a lot of interventions that actually change people's behavior, which is what I was interested in. The question is, how do you actually introduce those in a way so that they're going to be received and sustained over a period of time? And what I believe now is that it really comes down to the mindset of the leaders and people who have power, who might not necessarily be the leaders hierarchically, but people who are powerful in the organization, who other people look up to. So for instance, when it comes to some of the policing interventions that I looked at, the ones that were successful were really the ones where there was a very popular, honestly, a popular person who other people liked, who brought the idea in, socialized it, made it seem inviting and interesting and like something that people wanted to do. And that, to me, it seemed was just as important as the actual intervention itself, like getting the buy-in, getting the socialization, getting people kind of on board, and putting the right people in place to make sure that that happened. Because another really powerful policing intervention that I discovered was a small group in Watts in California, and a program that was introduced by the civil rights lawyer named Connie Rice, who is just a brilliant lawyer and also just a political strategist. And she figured out how to introduce this particular, it's basically a community safety policing program. But what she did was let me back up. The way that it works is by flipping police incentives. So instead of incentivizing police and rewarding them and promoting them on the basis of making arrests, they are rewarded and promoted on the basis of forming relationships with people. So the idea is you change the incentives. And in this case also, what has been shown is that when you change the incentives, people's behavior changed. So the officers' behavior did change as a result. But she figured out how to also put it in place, bring the right people in, get it socialized, get a lot of buy-in from the community, from the officers. So so there's a lot of sort of personal strategy that goes into making these programs work.
Right. So it seems like there's the intervention, and then there's all the work that goes up to like how you make the intervention to help it be a success.
Yes.
To switch topics a little bit, but I think it also goes back to, leadership from the top. The New York Times ran a graphic of a study that you conducted with a computer scientist at the University at Buffalo. And it showed how small acts of bias can accumulate over a woman's career, resulting in, the highest ranks of corporations being male dominated, even though, if you start out with even numbers at the entry level. And so I wondered if you could talk about the kinds of bias women encounter, and then what businesses might do to combat, that kind of bias.
Absolutely. The program that the simulation that you're describing is one that I developed with a computer scientist because I was really trying to understand what the long-term cumulative effect of everyday fleeting kinds of bias is. And when we look at studies of bias, they tend to be like snapshots. So you'll see bias at the moment of hiring, or bias at the moment of performance evaluation. But in reality, people experience bias continually and repeatedly over careers. So I was interested in that. And some of the biases that women face at work that are really common are having their work slightly devalued compared to men's. being penalized more for errors. So there was a study that showed that women surgeons are more penalized for having a negative outcome than male surgeons, and also less, they get fewer referrals after a positive outcome. So kind of both less valued and also more penalized. Losing credit when women and men, for instance, co-author a paper, I'm trying to remember the specifics, but I think it's in economics, the study was. Heather Starsons did this paper about how the more women co-author economics papers with male co-authors, the less likely they are to get tenure. But when women co-author papers with other women, you don't see that effect. So getting less credit.
Is the logic that like they didn't do that much of the work?
Yeah. The idea is that when women and men work together, the woman is seen as having contributed less. Women are penalized for straying from kind of certain generally accepted feminine personality, stereotypically feminine personality types, being nurturing. They're penalized for being self-promoting or being perceived as self-promoting. So those are some of the, I mean, I could go on, but I'll stop there before everyone gets incredibly depressed and just wants to log off and bury their head in the sand. Yeah. So, and there was a second part to your question.
So the second part is, what can businesses do to counteract that?
Right.
Those cumulative effects.
Right. So, there are a lot of things that can be done. Again, with the caveat that it's really important what leaders believe and how leaders are socializing these things. But there are a lot of things that can be done. I'll give you like a couple of examples. One thing is you can look for moments where people have individual discretion about when they're making a decision at work, and then look for ways to standardize some of the decision making. So in the case of an interview, people often go into an interview as an interviewer with some idea of what kinds of questions, but not like necessarily a standardized set of questions. And that means that different candidates are going to be getting different kinds of questions, and it's going to be hard to evaluate apples to apples. So standardizing questions, standardizing criteria for promotion, making things really transparent so that everybody knows what the criteria for promotions are, and making them standardized. There are some trainings that help, but there's some evidence that mandatory trainings can create backlash. So some voluntary trainings, if they have evidence behind them, can help. Mentorship and sponsorship, really active mentorship and sponsorship of marginalized groups can help. Those are some of the things that have some good data behind them.
Okay. Are there approaches that work for bias against some groups and then not for bias against other groups?
There's one approach that I find that I haven't totally gotten the answer to this one. It's still a little bit of a puzzle to me, but in the 1950s, there was a psychologist named Gordon Allport, and he came up with something called the contact hypothesis. And his idea was that if people can interact in meaningful ways with one another, where they are cooperating and they are working toward a shared goal, and they have some kind of institutional approval from an authority, and they are equal status, then that can work to decrease prejudice. And it seems to be true for some groups. So for instance, there's a really fascinating study about caste in India. And in this study, members of different castes were put on the same cricket team. And then there was a group where there was a control group where members were just of their own caste on cricket teams. And they found that when people were on a team with other people of different castes, it really changed their future feelings and behaviors. So they were more likely to have friends across caste. They were more likely to want to be on a team with someone across caste. So in that case, it seems like the contact hypothesis really was proven to be true. Where it doesn't seem to be as effective, as far as I can tell, is with gender. We know that there are plenty of situations where women and men work together at work. They're collaborating, they're at equal status, they are, cooperating on a shared goal. But we still see bias in the workplace in those contexts. And I don't know why. I would like to explore it. It's one of the, there's some sort of outstanding questions.
Sure.
When I finished the book, I didn't have all the
sure.
questions answered. And that's one. Why? Why does it seem to work for some groups and not others?
Interesting. While Jess is talking about her outstanding questions, I would just like to remind folks that feel free to generate your own questions, and we'll allow time for Jess to answer them at the end. So you mentioned, when you were talking about trainings at work, the ones that have evidence behind them. And it seems like there's been a big push for all of these trainings now. Like, sort of, how do we ensure that a lot of money and time doesn't go to things that don't have the science behind them, which might end up not really doing anything, as opposed to the things that, have been tested, have been shown to work?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, there's a psychologist named Betsy Paluck who has a quote. I don't know if I can remember it verbatim, but she says something like, these prejudice interventions, whether they're trainings at work or other kinds, really need to be evaluated on the level of a medical intervention, because many of these trainings and interventions that are used out in the world have never been evaluated. So they could be making things better, they could be making things worse, they could be creating backlash, they could be having no effect. We just don't know. And unfortunately, I think sometimes they're looked at as like a quick, easy fix. An organization is maybe concerned about legal compliance, or they want to be doing something, they want to be seen as doing something, and so they have people participate in a training, and a lot of them we just don't know. They could be effective, but we just don't know, because so many of them aren't even evaluated. I think the most kinds of questions that are used to evaluate are usually about people's reactions to the training. Did you like it? Do you feel like you learned something? So, but your question is like, what do we do about this? So I think what I would say is, make sure that your training has been evaluated, that there are some that there is some data that suggests that it is having a positive effect. Figure out what your goal is. I mean, I think another problem is that people don't even necessarily know what the goal of this is. Is it to, how do we measure whether it's working? Do we look at the, rate of progress of women or people from other marginalized groups? Do we ask those groups whether they feel more included a year after the training? Do we look at how power is apportioned and whether that has made a difference, or whether the makeup of management has, changed? I think it's important to figure out what the goals are and then be able to measure against. But yeah, I mean, ultimately it comes down to a question of what the leaders' goals are, really. Hopefully they're not just for legal compliance, checking a box, or image management, or, things like that. If the goal is really to tackle the problem of bias and make sure that it is a truly fair organization where everyone can thrive and everyone can feel like, equally included, access to power, access to resources, access to decision-making, then it takes much more than a training to get there, but a training can be one step if it's a good one.
Sure. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then maybe we'll check in and see if there's any questions from the audience. But, so you've talked about kind of interventions in businesses and interventions in like police forces and that kind of organization. You also write really fascinating about some studies that were conducted in schools. And I wanted to know if you could just like pick out one that you thought was really illustrative and tell us about it.
Yeah, there were a lot in schools. Let's see, what would be some interesting, an interesting one. I mean, one of the case studies that I looked at was a Swedish preschool called Egalia. And this is a preschool where teachers were really making as much effort as they could to not impose gender norms on students. And so that included things like not referring to students as boys and girls, but just saying friends, or using students' names rather than saying he went there or she went there. Making sure that they used the Swedish word hen, which is a gender neutral pronoun, if the gender was unknown, like someone coming in to interview to be a cafeteria worker. And that when that was evaluated, they found some really interesting, there were some really interesting findings. So some parents were concerned, or people in the community were concerned that this approach was going to make it impossible for children to tell which gender was which, and they were going to be totally confused. And what the study, when the children were studied, the researchers found that they actually had no problem telling, discerning if their friend was, if their friend presented as a girl and identified as a girl, they could say that was a girl. They didn't have sort of category confusion. But what did change about those students is that they were less likely to stereotype one another. So they were less likely to assume the kind of toys that a girl would play with, or the kind of toys that a boy would play with. And they were more likely to choose a child of another gender to be on a team with them in the future, or to be friends with them in the future. So it didn't really change their perception of gender, but it started to change what gender meant in their minds. And that was a really fascinating experience, being at that school and meeting those children and teachers.
Oh, so you actually got to go?
Yeah, I was there. Yeah. Yes. Oh, I see we have some questions.
Yeah. So the first one that I see is, how do we address bias against the political other side?
Interesting. I think there's this phenomenon in psychology called outgroup homogeneity. And I find it a really powerful way to think about the kind of divisiveness that we have in this country right now. Outgroup homogeneity basically means that the group that I belong to, I see as varied and diverse and complex. And the group that I don't belong to, I see as monolithic and homogenous. And this is a huge problem, you can imagine, because if you see a group as homogenous, it's very easy to stereotype that group. And from stereotyping, you can easily start to discriminate against that group, or to just generalize about that group in a way that is harmful and makes it really hard to have meaningful conversations and relationships. So I think that to address that, I honestly think this is where contact theory actually could be promising, because when we form meaningful relationships with others, we start to break down some of our ideas about homogeneity, and we start to see the other as complex and as various as ourselves, as our own group. And I think whatever side of the political divide you're on, I think that is a really helpful way to get around some of the kinds of entrenched biases. So I'd say meaningful relationships, cooperative, collaborative, that would be one place to start.
Wow. I feel like just when you mentioned that idea of like the other side being like all the same, while your own group is, very diverse and varied, like, that is exactly what's going on. I mean, you just see that everywhere. You see that on social media, you see that in op-eds in the newspaper. Fascinating. So we talked about this a little bit, but you can also involve, changes that you went along the way. But how long did it take you to write the book from idea, which you've already mentioned was 2 decades ago, to completion?
Let's see. It depends on what you define as the start point. I remember the specific moment where I said to my husband, I think I want to write a book about this, because I've been writing articles since like 2006. I'd been writing articles about bias, mostly about gender bias at that point, in the like 2000s. And I had written a few stories that got a lot of traction, that kind of went viral around like 2014, 2015. And it was around, I think it was like December 2015, where I was like, I think there's something much bigger that I really want to tackle here. And particularly, like, what do we do about this problem? Because I assumed someone had already written this book. Honestly, I assumed there was a popular science book out there that synthesized all of these ways that we can combat this problem. And when I couldn't find it, and I felt like there was a lot more to be done and to think through, that's when I really committed to writing the book. And so that would have been early 2016. And I would say I finished, it was, I mean, Kim, you were there through the gory ups and downs. I mean, it was a long process. It was through the entire Trump presidency. So 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. I mean, I was doing copy edits in 2021 so 5.5 years, I'd say.
And the conversation, like, in society changed and evolved so much, right? You started before Trump became president, you ended like after he is out of office. But as I said, watching the gory process, as you admitted, I mean, I think it took so long because you're committed to doing it right, which is something I really respect.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, another question is, what is your perspective on CRT and how it has been used politically?
Ooh, I feel like I have not done enough reading of critical race theory to really wade too much into that question. It seems like I mean, it seems, I almost don't even want to say too much, because I'll just say that it seems to me that there are a series of strawman arguments that are being put up against CRT that don't actually have anything to do with it. Like, people are saying we can't teach CRT because we abhor the idea that this country is irredeemably racist. I don't think there are anyone in the CRT canon is saying the country is irredeemably racist. I think it's much more complex than that. So it seems to be a political straw man that I probably don't want to wade into too much.
Sure. No, I mean, and again, respect to the idea of like reading about it.
Yes, right.
Before offering an opinion.
Right.
As everyone should.
Right. I mean, I've read some critical race theory, but I'm not as deeply, immersed in the scholarship.
Another one, perhaps more tied in directly to your work. The study on gender in children was interesting. How do we maneuver how children learn/unlearn bias as parents, educators, family members, etc.?
How do we maneuver how children learn and unlearn bias as parents, educators? One thing that's really interesting about children is that they absorb both our verbal instruction and our statements, but they also absorb our nonverbal behavior. So in some ways, I'll have to think about this a little bit more, but I mean, I think in some ways, if we're talking about children, it's a matter of putting on your own oxygen mask, before assisting others, and really working on, as adults, working on our own ways of interacting in more just and fair and life-affirming ways. And that starts to trickle down to our children. that's one idea. I mean, I think additionally, having open, honest and, loving conversations with children is also extremely helpful. There are, it's complicated. There are some tensions because some of the studies that I write about show that that insisting on categories itself can be a problem. Like there's a whole chapter where I talk a lot about Becky Bigler's work on child development, and she found that she did sort of experiments where she had kids put on yellow t-shirts and blue t-shirts, and then she had some classrooms where teachers said, okay, yellow students do this and blue students do that, and really emphasized the idea of categories, the children's categories. And some teachers totally ignored the categories. And in the rooms where teachers were really insistent on categories, children became much more certain of their own group status. They liked their own group more and disliked the other group more. So there's this, suggestion that like really solidifying categories is part of the problem. So to get to the question, one thing that we could do is start to kind of break down and question some of those categories and emphasize them less in schools.
So interesting. So even if the categories aren't boys and girls, even if the categories are like blue shirts and yellow shirts, that people are kind of like clinging on to that category and having some tension with whatever the other category is.
Yeah, because when our brain does really specific things with categories, like as soon as we, have a group as we have categories in our minds, we start to overestimate the similarities between the members of that category, and we underestimate the similarities across categories. We also overestimate the differences across categories. So in some sense, it's like the human condition, it's a human problem because we have to categorize each other, but too much categorization can have negative consequences. I mean, I wish we could do a whole hour just on Becky Bigler's studies because they're really fascinating and kind of ethically dubious because she's experimenting with like children.
Okay.
But yeah,
okay.
There's a lot there.
Okay, so I'm not totally sure I understand the import of this question, but I'll see if you have an answer for it, which is, what advice do you have for someone who sees gendered situations as inherently unequal?
I wonder, could that person explain a little more what they mean?
I wish there's like in person so you could ask a follow-up.
I know.
I feel like I'm just not 100% sure.
Who sees gendered situations as inherently unequal?
Well, while we wait to see if we get a clarification,
maybe are they talking maybe about complementarity? I mean, in some, like there are, I don't know if this is where so I apologize, viewer, if I'm not getting if I'm not interpreting you correctly, but I mean, there are some cultures that see genders as different but complementary, and that women have certain roles and men have certain roles, and they're not one isn't greater or lesser than the other, but they're complementary to one another. But maybe but that wouldn't be inherently unequal, suggests kind of a hierarchy. So I'm not totally sure.
Yeah. As I said, we'll wait for clarification. We only have 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask another question and then we'll see if we get any more information on that one. So clearly with the project of this scope, you can't fit everything in. So can you talk about something that you didn't have room for, that you ended up cutting? Now's your chance to bring it back to life.
Reanimate part 2, the end of bias part 2.
That's right.
Bride of bias. There was a section that I would have really liked to include, which was about confronting in real time. I mean, especially since I've been doing these book events, since the book has come out, one question that people ask is, well, okay, this is all fine and good, but what if I'm in a situation where somebody else is acting in a biased way? Like, what's the best way to respond? And I think it's a really important question. What I would say is that research suggests that there are like 3 things to keep in mind that have to do with basic human needs. We have a need for autonomy, we have a need for competence, feeling competent, and we have a need for relatedness. So if we are confronting someone who is acting in a way that we have questions about, or we're not sure if they're acting in a biased way, keeping in mind that person's need for autonomy, their freedom to behave how they want to, their feeling of competence that they can actually do what is needed, and a feeling of relatedness. So instead of kind of like shutting someone down, doing something like asking a question, inviting the person in, finding a way to maintain a relationship while kind of challenging or questioning or pushing a little bit on some of the behavior can be a way to actually move the behavior in a better direction rather than shutting someone down. Because the risk, of course, is always that someone completely shuts down, and then you've gotten nowhere.
Because you've cut off one of those avenues or one of those needs.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. So interesting. I think that we're about at time. Connor, is that your perception as well? I'm talking to the logo there. Yeah. There's one last question here. Okay, if you can do it in 2 minutes.
I'm not. Oh yeah. Do you want to read it? And then I just have a question about the question. I got.
We're full of questions about the questions. Have you done any research or given any thought to how people's biases about how you present in the world may have affected the results that you've gotten? So people's response to you, I think.
The results, meaning the results of the how they might have interacted differently. Yeah. Yes, that's really interesting. I mean, I think that, there's another, so how they may have interacted differently with you, the reporter, if you were of a different gender or race, et cetera. I think that's a really interesting question, and one thing that I carried with me throughout this entire project was how I show up in the world as a white woman, what kind of access that gives me to certain spaces. There's a phenomenon called homophily, which means literally love of the same. And this is something that a lot of it, we're probably all susceptible to some extent, which is we gravitate toward people who remind us of ourselves. We feel comfortable. And so absolutely, I mean, I think that as the reporter, when I interacted with white women, they were very comfortable with me. And I might have gotten more information, more access than I would have had I been, of another kind of social identity. So I think it's a really interesting question, and it makes me feel even more strongly how that collaboration is really important, because we all can only, we all have sort of limited access in a certain way to the riches of the world, but more when we work together and each bring our own strengths and our own access and things like that.
Yeah, definitely.
Great question. Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know. I could keep going. I want to keep going.
We can talk all night, Connor. You're going to have to cut us off.
I think you can talk all night. I think people would be here for it, but that is our hour. Kim, thank you so much for your questions, and Jess for your answers. What a lovely conversation. It was absolutely great. I do want to say, again, I've said it a couple times in the chat, but please, if you have the means, events like this are made possible by the great work Jess has done. Please click the green button at the bottom of your screen and buy your copy of The End of Bias today. I also put a link to Sensational by Kim Todd in the chat as well. So if you want to support both of our writers this evening, please do so. As I mentioned at the beginning, we do have another event coming up in 2 days. I think some of the conversations for nice white ladies about white women's history involved in race relations might come up there too. So if you're interested in this, you might be interested in that event as well. Jess, thank you so much for joining us. Kim, thank you for joining us from Jess's house. This is the first time I've had moderator and author in the same place, and maybe next time we can have all of us, all 165 of us, all together in the same place.
I would love that. And can I just say that if people want to continue the conversation, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is on my website, which is jessicanordell.com.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I'll put Jessica Nordell's website in the chat as well, so you can see it after the fact. Thank you all for being here tonight. We look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Bye-bye.
So much. Bye-bye.